We are in Matthew chapter 21. We have just read the entire chapter, 46 verses. And what I want to talk today about is how Jesus is the cornerstone. What does that mean? That's the crux of this whole passage. I want to say this. This is so much to cover. I'm going to try to blaze through it, and then we'll talk about it over lunch, all right? So, we're taking a break from Romans, which is what we've been working our way through, to look at Jesus in the gospel for a couple of weeks because we're approaching the season of Easter, right? This is Palm Sunday. Next Sunday is Easter. This Friday is Good Friday. We'll be having a dinner at my house. I'll send out emails for that. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, okay, we usually think about them as accounts of Jesus's life. But almost 40% of the Gospels, if you go through each one of those Gospels, is actually focused around the events that happen in the final week of Jesus's life. In other words, the Gospels are really not just about Jesus's life, but about his death and about his resurrection. And then the book of Acts is about what that resurrection does in the life of his people. Okay, so this Friday, Jesus is going to die, Good Friday. Next Sunday, he's going to rise. But today is the day that he enters Jerusalem on a donkey. And this is normally what we preach on, like on a Palm Sunday. And we spend 30 minutes or 40 minutes talking about Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, and we try to find something interesting. And there's plenty of interesting stuff. But if you focus in on those 11 verses, I actually think Matthew, I'm more and more convinced of this, wants us to read this entire chapter as a set of passages that are speaking to one another. There's all sorts of interweaving going on here, okay? In other words, if you focus on the first 11 verses, you're going to miss the significance that Matthew is trying to show us in the entire chapter, 46 verses. So, here's what we're going to do today. First of all, what's the story? I'm going to summarize 7 scenes for you. Second, what's the gospel in the story? I'm going to give you 4 big takeaways. Third, I just want you to think about where are you in the story? What's the story? Gospel in the story. Where are you in the story? That's kind of what we'll talk about over lunch. All right, you ready? Fasten your seatbelts. What's the story? There are 7 scenes, and what I want to do, we've read them. I just want to draw out a couple of key things from each story. What is most crucial? Okay? What's the crux? First of all, the triumphal entry, verses 1 through 11. Jesus rides into town on the donkey. What's the key point? It's that Jesus is a king. He's doing something, okay? Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you. He's fulfilling an Old Testament passage that says the Messiah, when he comes, is going to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. That's the king, okay? So the takeaway is Jesus is a king, but he's humble. He's riding on a donkey, okay? The crowd gets it. Sort of. Hosanna. Okay. But 5 days later, where's the crowd? They're like, we don't know who this guy is. Execute him. See what I'm saying? For someone so humble, I want you to notice how strong he is in the passages that follow. All right? That's the first thing. He's a king. He's humble, but he's also strong. Okay? Second thing. The cleansing of the temple, verses 12 through 17. Here what I want you to see is that Jesus is stern, okay? He turns over tables, but he's also compassionate, all right? It's very easy to miss this. Remember that in Jewish culture, the Messiah is not just a king or a ruler, but there is also a religious component. In other words, it's church and state. They go together. The Messiah, the king, is supposed to help turn hearts back to God. So when Jesus shows up, the king, riding on a donkey, the first place he goes is into the temple. All right? And what he sees there, he basically goes to revitalize their worship. So he goes to the place of worship, and what he sees, he doesn't like. He finds that it's become a place of commerce, art of the deal. He uses the language of robbers, okay? Rather than house of prayer, intercession. In other words, that's the fruit that God is looking for from his people. Prayers of intercession, prayers of gratitude, prayers of mercy, constant talking to God. There is a deep irony in this passage, and I want you to see it. The people in charge, the chief priests and the scribes, this would be the equivalent of our pastors, our theologians, our clergy. Those are the people that you would most expect to recognize Messiah, and do they? No, they don't. They completely miss him. The people not even allowed in the temple. Do you know that? The lame and the blind, according to the Old Testament, are not allowed in the temple. Okay? But it actually says, okay, that they come to him in the temple. I don't know if they rush. I like to picture these lame people rushing the guards, hobbling. And there's just so many of them. And the guards are like, you can't be in here. And there's blind guy groping by. Okay, it's actually really humorous. These people that ought to be able to see can't. And these people that can't see, can't walk, they can't do anything. They are clawing their way in. And when the authorities are like, what are you doing here? Jesus, blind aren't allowed in the temple. Lame aren't allowed in the temple. What does Jesus do? Heals them. And he's like, I don't see any blind people. I don't see any lame people. What's the problem? Do you see the irony of that? Okay, now listen. There is a passage in Isaiah 35 that talks about God when he brings his kingdom, and it says he's going to come, God, not Messiah, God is going to come, and he says the eyes of the blind will be opened, even the ears of the deaf will be unstopped, the lame man will leap like a deer. Okay, now listen. They ought to recognize that God is in their freaking midst. And they can't see it, the religious leaders. And the little kids are like, Hosanna! The little kids see it. Okay? The people who are blind see. The people who ought to be able to see are blind. You see that irony there? That's what you need to take away from this passage. Okay, third, fig tree. This is verses 18 to 22. This is a visible parable like charades. You guys all know what charades is, right? You know what charades is? Yes? Okay. You can tell when somebody's doing charades. Sounds like, okay. In the same way, Jesus is using words here, but his disciples really should have been able to see what he was doing. In other words, he's like, I am very hungry. There is a fig tree over there. Let's go see if the fig tree has any fruit. Okay, and Mark interjects it when he tells this story. He's like, it's not even the season for fruit. The disciples should have been like, okay, he's doing a charade here. He's doing a parable. And he gets over there and he's like, there's no fruit. Bad tree. And the fruit withers. Now listen. All the disciples are like, whoa, did you see that? The tree just withered. And what they should have been saying is, the point is, bear fruit. Do you see what I'm saying? They completely missed. They're awestruck by the power. Okay, and we're kind of awestruck by the poor little tree. And what we ought to be hearing is what the king wants is fruit. Okay? The king wants fruit. Fruit is all over this chapter. And if you say, what does fruit look like? What it tells you in this passage is those who have faith and believe. Now we'll come back to that. But for right now, that's what I want you to see. King, okay? Cleansing the temple. He's stern but compassionate. What the king wants is fruit. Here's the fourth passage. His authority is challenged in verses 23 to 27. They say, by whose authority do you do this? And here's really what's going on. Jesus has just done things that only God can do, that God in the Old Testament promised to do. And they're like, who gave you the right to do this? And what they ought to be saying is, oh my goodness, God is in our midst. This is a moot question. They're not actually wondering about his authority. They're actually trying to find a reason to critique him. Okay?
This is like the end of the ministry. He said like tons of stuff to them before.
Yeah.
About,
yeah.
My Father in heaven and all this stuff.
Yeah. They ought to know the answer. And the point is, they're trying to get him to like validate himself. And he's like, look at what I do. That validates itself. So Jesus asks them a question about John the Baptist. And really what he's doing in this passage, he's revealing their own lack of fruit. Okay? Because they know that he's going to say, why didn't you believe? So do you see the connection? They make the connection that he's going to say, why didn't you believe John the Baptist? That's fruit language. Okay? The point is, if you believe John, let me say it this way. If you didn't believe John, is it any surprise that you wouldn't believe Jesus? For them, it's not about the truth. It's about what aligns with their agenda. And neither John nor Jesus aligns with the religious leader's agenda. Fifth passage. Jesus is going to give two parables. There's the parable of the two sons. This is verse 28 to 32. Now listen, where does this happen? In a vineyard. It's all about fruit. Okay, the father says, go work in the vineyard. In other words, get in the business of producing fruit, people. And the first son says, no, but then he eventually goes. The second son says, yes, sir, but he doesn't. The first son is like the tax collectors and the sinners. The second son is like the religious. They say all the right things, they've got all the right answers, but they're not actually doing or engaging in the work of the vineyard and the work of fruit. Which one did the will of the Father? In other words, the will of the Father, fundamentally, fruitfulness. He talks about entering the kingdom. Tax collectors and prostitutes, okay? They look like a no, but they actually resonate with Jesus. They believe what he says. Versus the religious and the experts. They look like a yes, but they actually refuse Jesus. They won't believe him. What's the difference between those who believe and those who don't believe? It's their attitude towards Jesus. Last parable, tenants. These are the workers in charge of the vineyard, verses 33 to 41. This is a very pointed parable. Even dense people, like the disciples, would have gotten it. The Pharisees got it. Who's the master? God. What does the master want? Fruit from his people. What are the people? The religious, the vineyard tenders. What do they want? They want the fruit for themselves. Okay? They actually want to be their own masters. They want the fruit for their own purposes. So what do? Kill, 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 kill. All the messengers, all the prophets that God sends. You've killed them. Okay? That happened historically. The Israelites had a tendency to kill their prophets because they didn't like the message. All right? What happens when the Father, the Master God, finally sends his Son? The answer is they kill him too. Let's kill the heir. What is the fruit of their actions? They say it themselves. Look at verse 41. Jesus says, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said, he will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons. All right? And then Jesus is going to do the final passage, the cornerstone, verses 43 to 44. This is the scene about judgment. He's going to issue a verdict on them. Have you never read the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. Okay? Jesus says plainly, God is building something with the very thing, the person you've rejected, me. He quotes Psalm 118, the stone the builders have rejected has become the cornerstone. And then he says this, the kingdom will be taken away from you and it will be given to a people producing its fruits. See the fruit again? It's all through this passage. You should be saying, gee, producing fruit. It must be important. It might be on the test. Maybe I should take notes on this part. All right? Do you see how all these passages are actually interconnected? When you think about Palm Sunday, you shouldn't just think about Jesus riding into Jerusalem. You should think about this entire chapter taken together. Now listen, very quickly, where's the gospel in this story? I'm going to give you 4 takeaways, 4 arrows, 4 lightning bolt lasers that you can see when you start to connect these passages. There's a claim, there's a curse, there's a blessing, there's a verdict. You ready? This stuff is worth taking notes on. First of all, what's the claim? It's that Jesus is claiming to be a king. You see that? It's not just the disciples are claiming that Jesus was king. When Jesus gets on that donkey and rides into Jerusalem, he is claiming, I'm the king. And what does the king actually want? I would say he wants to be the king of your heart. Not the king of your lip service. Not the king of your theological answers. Jesus actually wants to be the king of his people's hearts. Now listen, how to tell what is the king of your heart? What's the king or the queen of your heart? Let me give you an example. You want to know? The answer is, what makes you say yes to things that you'd rather say no to, or no to things that you'd rather say yes to? Let me give you an example. Okay, remember the first time you started dating somebody early on, and she's like, hey, do you want to go to the mall with me? Hell no, I don't want to go to the mall. But what do I say? Yes, I'd love to go to the mall and walk around for hours mindlessly and seeing all our friends. Why do you do that? Because she's the king or the queen of your heart at that moment. Now, you usually outgrow it. But the point is, all of us have things that are king and queen of our heart. And what it does is it makes us do things that we don't want to do or not do things that we do want to do. Let me give you some examples. Okay. How many of us work, career, or success starts to become the king of our heart? And it's like, listen, I don't want to work all weekend. I don't want to work 80 hours a week. I don't want to do this. But the king of our heart, which might be security, it might be success, it might be money, whatever it is like, oh, you better do it. And so we do something we don't want to do because that's the king of our heart. Let me give you another example. Okay, porn. I know a lot of guys that are like, I don't want to do porn. But then we do. Why? Because there is something deep in our heart that desires that. Okay? And maybe it's sex, maybe it's affection, all sorts of things that it could be. But the point is, what moves us to do things that we don't want to do or to not do things that we do want to do, that's very revealing of what the king of our heart is. And Jesus says, I want to be the king of your heart. So when I say, take up your cross and follow me, I don't want to take up my cross and follow Jesus, but if he's the king of my heart, I'm going to do it. When Jesus says, save your sexuality for marriage, most of us probably don't want to do that. But you know what? If Jesus is the king of my heart, I'm going to be like, I'm going to do that for him. When Jesus says, love the person you're married to, there's times where I'm like, that is not what I want to do. But if Jesus is the king of my heart, I will. Do you see what I'm getting at? Jesus wants to be not just the king, but he wants to be the king of his people's heart. That's the first takeaway. And just ask yourself, is that true? What's the king of your heart? See how that's a really good question to ask? Second thing, The curse. You know when he curses the tree? It actually has everything to do with fruit. You can see fruit language all through this passage, right? Okay. The king or the master wants and expects his people to be producing fruit. The kingdom is taken from those who aren't. It is given to those who are. You could almost say that the kingdom is all about fruit. It's the air we breathe in the kingdom, the soil we till in the kingdom. The kingdom is life on the farm. That's what the kingdom is. Hope you like to work. Hope you like fruit. Jesus is saying this is what God is about. And that should raise the question, what's the fruit? Okay, now I'm going to give you an example. Some of you, Malachi and Marilyn, have seen me give this example before. Don't answer this. I don't know if anybody else has. Okay, I have a cup. What's in the cup? Water. Okay. See if I can do this without destroying something. Okay, I want you to think. Watch. Everybody watch. You watching? Okay. Can you see this? Okay, you can see it great. Watch. Why is there water on the floor? What?
You hit the cup.
Oh, who said that?
Esther.
Oh, Esther. Oh, whoa. Why is there water on the floor?
Because you hit the cup.
Let me ask this question again. Why is there water on the floor?
Physics. I'm sorry.
Why? Okay, Anu. Why is there water on the floor? Anybody?
Can I answer now?
Because there's water in the cup.
Oh, wow.
Oh, listen. Follow me on this for just a second.
Yes.
Fruit, guys, fruit is what comes out of you when you're squeezed. Fruit is what comes out of you when you're bumped. Fruit is what comes out of you when you're crushed. Listen, you squeeze an orange, what comes out? Juice. You trod on grapes, what comes out? Juice, which is going to become wine. Okay, olives get pressed, grain gets milled, nuts get cracked open. Okay, raisins and figs get dried. The point is, let me say it this way. When somebody cuts you off in traffic and you lose your mind, you know what's producing that? It's not them. It's inside of you. You just got bumped. Okay? When you don't get the thing you want and you react in anger, it's not the thing. It's what's inside of you. Okay? When life doesn't go the way you plan and you are fearful, it's not whatever's happening out there, it's what's inside of you. Jesus is saying when you get squeezed, when you get crushed, when people say all sorts of evil about you. You want an example? Okay. This past week, we had to make a really hard call at Lazarus. We have this thing called the Patron Saint Program, which for the last 10 years, it's like every day you either get a free beer or a free coffee. Okay? Which is a pretty sweet gig. You got to come in to get it. But the point is, we were like, the costs on the coffee are literally killing us. Like a full person's salary every year just in coffee. I'm like, I can't keep doing this. So we announced to our patron saints, that like, hey guys, we hate to do this, but we're going to have to cut off the coffee benefit. Have you guys heard the phrase, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned? Okay, listen, I got some emails, and there was this one email from she who shall not be named. But it was like, how dare you? You know, that you gave your word, you promised, you know, this is like a fundamental human right. And she's, I'm exaggerating a little bit. She also questioned my Christianity, okay?
Oh my.
She's a Christian. She's like, I'm a Christian and a businessman. Anyway, all right. Do you know what I wanted to respond? Yeah. I'm like, when did she get her patron saint? 3.5 years ago. So I go and do a little research. Over the last 6 months, she's utilized her free coffee 110 times.
Oh.
Run that out over 3.5 years. She's received $2,500 in free coffee. And I'm thinking, bitch. Okay. Now listen. I was so convicted. See, what's happening is I'm getting squeezed. And what comes out is actually this defensiveness. And I was convicted by this passage. What actually needs to come out, listen, he's talking about fruit. In the Bible, what word gets connected with fruit? Spirit. Fruit of the Spirit. Galatians 5. Do you know what it says it is? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. Who's the person that as he gets bumped, as he gets hit, as he gets slandered, what doesn't come out as anger, comes out as love? It's Jesus. Jesus is saying, he's on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. I'd be like, Father, you need to kick those asses. Because do you see what I'm saying? In other words, Jesus is king. He wants to be the king of your heart. And the most important thing that he wants from his people is that when you are crushed and squeezed, what actually comes out is blessings, not cursing. Go read the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies. He wants love to come out. Pray for those who persecute you. He wants prayers to come out. Okay? Somebody says, you owe me a mile. He says, give him 2 miles. Okay? You owe me your tunic. Give him your cloak as well. The only way we can do that is if we have the fruit inside. We need fruit inside of us. All right? The religious people in this passage are getting squeezed by Jesus, and what comes out is anger, spite, and venom. And you know what comes out from most of us Christians most of the time when we get squeezed? Anger, spite, venom. We don't look any different. All right? What comes out of you when you get squeezed? What comes out of you when you get bumped? Now listen, if Jesus is, think about this. He looks at the tree that doesn't have fruit and he's like, cursed. Whoa. What comes out of you when you're bumped? What comes out of you? See what I'm saying? That should be sobering.
Is he giving the example of what that looks like? Or is it, because his example should not be followed in the case of a tree.
Yeah,
What I'm gathering.
listen, first of all, Jesus is not saying, hey, y'all go curse people that don't have fruit.
He's saying that's what he does.
Jesus, now, what I want you to watch here is Jesus is saying, this is what fruitless trees deserve. This is what fruitless trees will eventually get from God. This is, in other words, he's like, my kingdom is going to be a vineyard where every tree in that freaking garden, no matter how much you squeeze it, it just bleeds fruit. It bleeds goodness. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, prayer, blessing, shalom. That's what he wants. Now listen, you ready for the third one? See how interesting this is when you start reading this passage against itself? Here's the third one, blessing. All right, curse, blessing. Who gets blessed in this passage? That's a weird thing. You're like, I don't really see it. Who gets blessed? Do you know, Esther? Okay. Who gets blessed in this passage? Somebody gets a really big blessing. There's a blind guy. He can see. There's lame people. They can walk. All right? There are tax collectors. Fuckers. Seriously, that's how the Jews felt about him. They were people that sold out their own Jewish relations to work for the Romans because they could make a lot of money. They were hated, okay, because they extorted. It'd be like, yeah, I mean, you can think of examples. If you were a Palestinian working for the Israelis, how do you think your people are going to feel about you? Not happy. Jesus says tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom ahead of you. And what you should do is you should go, wait just a second. Number one, it's not the Pharisees, it's not the priests, it's not the scribes, it's not even the disciples that get the blessing in this passage. They're kind of observers learning lessons. It's the lame and the blind, they get healed. It's the tax collectors and the prostitutes, they get to enter the kingdom. It's given to them. And here's why this is significant. We live in America where there is a cultural narrative that God blesses the good and the deserving. If you are a good person, God is going to give you a reward, heaven. Who are the good people in this passage? The religious. They're the ones that are going to church. Okay? They're the ones that are like giving their money to help the poor. They're the ones that are not like ripping off their brothers. They're the ones that aren't like having sex with prostitutes. They're the ones doing all of this stuff that looks good. And Jesus goes, no, they missed it because they didn't have the heart. In other words, Jesus is not using morality as a gauge of goodness. And he's not using religiosity as a gauge of goodness. And he's not using theology, do you have the right answers, as a gauge of goodness. He's not using power as a gauge of goodness. He's not using like public prestige as a gauge of goodness. Instead, he picks these people that have nothing to commend themselves to God. And this is the part that gets really radical. These people, the lame and the blind, they can't do anything to even earn God's favor if they wanted to because they're lame and they're blind. Okay? The tax collectors have sold out their own people. The prostitutes are selling their own bodies in exchange for sex. Okay, these people aren't producing any fruit. And you should go, wait just a second. He just told this parable about how what's really, really, really important is fruit. And here's a people who don't seem like they've produced any kind of fruit, and they're getting the kingdom? How can that be? Whatever blessing they get, it's sheer grace. Okay? You could say it this way. If there is any fruit from the lame and the blind, the tax collectors and the prostitutes, you know what it is? They ran to Jesus and they despaired of themselves. They were like, I can't do anything about my condition. Help. Okay? Have mercy. All right? There's nothing in there that says we deserve it, which is what the religious leaders thought. So how do they get in? And this brings us to the fourth point, which is the verdict. All right? Follow this so far? Jesus is a king. He wants to be the king of your heart. What's the king of your heart? Second, Jesus, wants to see fruit, and the lack of fruit is reason for cursing. Third, the people who get blessed don't seem to produce. In other words, you don't produce fruit in order to get blessed. Somehow the blessing precedes the production of fruit. Malachi.
It's really interesting because Brennan was pointing out the faith that'll move mountains.
Yep.
And you kind of see this everywhere in the New Testament. Jesus' disciples aren't moving mountains before he dies. And that's not actually what gets them in. So the faith that moves mountains.
It's not like having that faith is like, oh, Jesus goes, you've got enough faith. Congratulations, come on in.
It's actually a gift that's given to.
It's a gift,
right?
yeah.
It's not a side effect of being a believer. It's a gift that's given when you don't have that faith.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that we look at that all the time. We're like, why can't we move mountains? We must not have enough faith to try harder. And the answer is not try harder. The answer is coming to Jesus saying, I don't have the faith to do this. And
Somebody who has commitment issues, you mentioned that. You know what the solution is? It's not to try harder, to be more committed. It won't actually. You need something else that will produce the commitment. So let's look at this last thing. This is the most interesting part of this passage, and I hope I can explain it quickly. Verdict. Think about a courtroom. Okay, I'm talking specifically about this tail end of the passage, verses 42 down through 44, when Jesus says, have you never, well, actually, let's include 41. They give their verdict on his parable. What do people who don't do, they're like, oh man, God ought to kill those bastards. Okay? Wretches. Okay? Put them to a miserable death. That's their verdict on what God ought to do. They're actually right in one sense, very wrong in another. Okay, look at Jesus' verdict. I'm saying verdict. If you think about a courtroom, what happens at the very end of a trial is you get somebody from the jury comes out and they're going to give a verdict, which is either, what are the two options? Guilty or not guilty. Okay? Let me give you another one. Think of you guys have all seen Gladiator. Okay, the Colosseum, combat. Do you know what happened oftentimes if a gladiator could defeat the enemy, like his enemy's defeated? He hasn't killed him yet. He's got him there at sword tip. And he looks up at Caesar. And you remember what Caesar does? He either goes, thumbs up, let him live. Thumbs down, put him to death. Same kind of thing. It's a verdict. What is happening here in this passage is the same sort of thing. You're getting a verdict on all of the stuff that's come before this. He's quoting, now he's using a different image because he's Jewish and he knows his Bible. So instead of a courtroom image or a Colosseum image, he actually goes to the Old Testament and he quotes this thing, which is a cornerstone image. But what I want you to see is the cornerstone has this concept of a verdict built into it. And you can see it in the passage. He's quoting Psalm 118. He says, the stone that the builders rejected. You hear that? The rejectors are like, this is a lousy stone. We can't build on this. Get rid of it. Verdict. And God says, no, this is the exact stone that I'm going to use to build a palace on. Cornerstone. Different verdict. Now listen. That image of a cornerstone doesn't just show up in Psalm 118. So if you were a Jew and you hear this, and the early Christians started using the language this way, it actually connects to a couple of different places. I'm going to tell you what they are. First of all, in Isaiah 28, prophecy about when God is going to come and dwell with his people. There is language of this word, which gets translated in the Greek scandalon, but it's a stone of stumbling. It trips people up. In other words, Isaiah 28 says God is going to come and do something, and he's going to use this stone of stumbling. It's going to be so unexpected that it trips people up. And some people are going to trip over it, and other people are going to be like rescued by it. Okay? Daniel chapter 2. Remember Daniel? Daniel in the lion's den? Okay? Have you ever heard that story? No. Okay, great. I love hanging out with people that don't know any of the stories. It's so refreshing. In the Old Testament, there is a story about some guys. This is after Israel has been taken captive by the Babylonians. Okay, and there's 4 guys that get mentioned specifically. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They get thrown in a fiery furnace in Babylon because they won't serve the king, and God rescues them in the fiery furnace. But there's another scene where the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, he's a Babylonian king. These guys are living in Babylon now. And Daniel, who's one of these young men who's been taken captive, the king has a dream, and all of his interpreters are like, tell us the dream and we'll interpret it. And the king's like, no, you tell me the dream. And if you get it right, then I'll listen to your interpretation. If you get it wrong, I'm like, hey, Anu, I had a dream last night. You tell me what it is. And if you can tell me what it is, I might believe whatever you think it means. And everybody's like, oh, shit. Okay? But somebody heard that Daniel knows how to interpret dreams. So Daniel gets run up before him, and Daniel says, here's your dream. because God tells us, God's the one who gives dreams. He says, your dream was of a statue, gold at the top, silver in the chest, then bronze, then iron down by the legs, and then the feet are kind of clay mixed with iron. All right? And he says, you're the gold. And he basically says, he interprets it, there's 5 empires, 5 kingdoms. So the Babylonian Empire is the golden kingdom. It's going to be followed by the Medes and the Persians, the Assyrians, eventually the Greeks are in there, the Romans. Okay, but here's the point. He says at the very end of this vision, he goes, but then and it gets weaker and more brittle as it goes down. And he says, and then there is a stone not made by hands that smashes the statue. And he says, that's God's kingdom. And he says, all the other kingdoms are shattered to pieces, crushed to dust, blown by the wind. There is nothing left. And he goes, that stone becomes a mountain that lasts forever. Okay, do you see the parallel? So in other words, cornerstone, stumbling stone, foundation, crushes. Okay. Jesus is the stone. He's the mountain. When Jesus falls on somebody, look at what he says here. This is really interesting. I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. The second part of that, when it falls on anyone, it will crush him, all the Jews went like, oh yeah, that's the point from Daniel. This stone crushes all the other stones. But there's something he adds to this. This is the weird part. Anyone who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. What does that mean? Okay. There's a distinction here. In other words, the stone that Jesus falls on, Jesus is the stone. The people Jesus falls on, crushed. Like the Pharisees, the religious leaders. But there's other people that fall on Jesus and they're shattered, they're broken to pieces, okay? But they're not crushed. It's different. See if I can explain it this way. If you're paralyzed, you're lame, or you're blind, what do you have to offer God? Nothing. If you have moral failure, you're a prostitute, you're a traitor to your people, what do you have to offer God? Nothing. Okay? There's nothing to commend yourself. Jesus lays out such a high moral vision in the Sermon on the Mount, it shatters you. In other words, as these people come to Jesus, that he actually says, get in on it, he's not like, oh, prostitutes are great, it's no big deal. He's like, no, it's a problem. Shattering. Jesus humbles everyone. The biblical Jesus doesn't make you feel good about yourself because of anything in yourself. But normally, this is what I want you to think about. When a rock gets shattered, what do you get out of it? Rubble. So here are these people that are falling on Jesus. They get shattered by Jesus as he assesses their lives as not very fruitful. But instead of getting rubble, you get bricks. And the New Testament picks up the idea in Ephesians that God is building his temple out of people that have been shattered by Jesus but put into bricks. In other words, people who reject Jesus, crushed, dust. But people who accept Jesus, they're actually shattered by him. His assessment of people, it's not good. You go, well, how on earth could they be like turned into something like useful? They're not good in and of themselves, but they are loved. Ah, there goes another one. They're loved. Let me give you one more thing here. What did the religious leaders expect God to do after he told them that last parable? He's going to take those wretched people and put them to death. Okay? What did Jesus actually do with those wretched people in the vineyard? He actually went to the cross. See what I'm saying? In other words, Jesus does what they don't expect. Jesus is the one person that actually has the virtue that he's looking for. No matter how much you squeeze him, what comes out is like pure fruit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. All right? So if there's anybody that deserves God's favor and God's righteousness and a place in the kingdom, it's Jesus. And yet he comes to these people that have actually rejected him, and they put him on trial. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't try to get out of it. They tell lies about him. He accepts it. He goes to the cross, and as he's being crucified, he prays, Father, forgive them. They don't know. Like, he actually bears what those people deserve. And the tax collectors and the sinners got a glimpse of this is how much I am loved. That this man who has fruit would go and stand in the place of all of us who don't have fruit, and he would take what we deserve and he would give what he has earned. And that becomes incredibly affirming. You are so valuable to God. And that's what makes him the king of your heart. Is you're like, if this is what he has done for me, I'll do anything for him. All right? Listen, where are you in the story? The Pharisees heard this story, the religious leaders, and they knew he was talking about them, and they got angry. Some people are going to hear this story, and they're just going to yawn. It's going to be apathy. But a few people are going to hear this story, and they're going to be humbled, and they're going to move, and they're going to run to Jesus, just like the lame and the blind people, stagger to Jesus, crawl to Jesus, whatever it is. And they're going to be like, help me. They're going to despair of themselves like the tax collectors and the prostitutes, and to say, we have nothing to offer you but our need, heal us. So what I want you to think about is, what's your response to Jesus? And that's what we can talk about over lunch. Okay? What lands with you in this passage? What are you going to do about it? How are you going to respond to what you're hearing? All right? What's the story? Gospel in the story. Where are you in the story? Let's pray.